All right, so welcome now to our 14th presentation in our series, Grappling with Complexity. I should mention just quickly a kind of housekeeping thing. There will be a slightly longer break between seminars after this one. I will be on leave for 2 weeks, and so our next seminar will be towards the end of August. I mean, I will send out invitations and notifications. That will be roughly about 27th, 28th of August. So just so that you don't think we've ended our series. We've got a whole lot of very exciting presentations lined up, but there will be a 2-week gap in between. So today we're very happy to welcome Chris Allsobrook into this space. Chris is the director of the Center for Leadership Ethics in Africa, and that is aligned with the University of Fort Hare. His field is African political philosophy, and he'll be talking today on something that is very puzzling, I think, to many of us. And that's the vigor, let's say that, with which some of our fellow humans have attached to conspiracy theories and the like. So we're very curious about this, and I'm not going to say any more about it. I would like to hand over to Chris and ask you to go ahead. Thanks, Chris.
Okay, thanks, Andrea, and thanks everyone for coming along today. I'm talking about conspiracy theories, but mostly I'll be talking about the background to that. So that's just a phenomenon of the problem I'll be talking about. So I'll get to that. And I'll give a little outline at the beginning of what this is going to be about, which is on ideology critique, papers on ideology critique, genealogy, and ancestry. So I'm writing at the moment. I'm on sabbatical, and I'm writing a book on this topic, and it's based on my PhD thesis from 10 years ago, which when I finished, I dropped, never to look at again, and only ready to practice. So that what I've been doing since has mostly been the mode of doing philosophy that I kind of advocated in my PhD, and now I'm going back to look at it and to add a bit so that I can finally publish on this. So I'm going to show you some slides for the most part, and I'll come back every now and again to talk directly to the camera, and I hope that's working. You're screen sharing. So am I screen sharing the right thing though? Can you see my PowerPoint presentation?
Yes, Chris, it's clear.
Okay, excellent. All right, great. So I hope you can see the whole thing.
Chris, you can put it onto the slideshow mode, I think.
Yeah, that's better. From beginning. There we go. I don't know, it might still not work, but anyway.
Oh, that's excellent. That looks fine.
Okay, so I just at the beginning, okay, I'm talking about genealogy, ideology critique, and ancestry. I've got a picture here. Recently, Zwelithini died, and there was a whole bunch of praise poetry, which was quite useful because precisely what I was looking at the time. It struck me as just recently this year that praise poetry engages in genealogy quite a lot, actually, and perhaps not straightforwardly like what Nietzsche was talking about, and sometimes actually doing precisely what Nietzsche was against in genealogy, which is validating the norms, the historical norms, right? As if what is now has always been. And genealogy is actually intended to do the opposite. But actually, praise poetry does both. What I've realized is there's a subtle critique going on, an ambiguity in it that gives it its creativity. It's both fixed and creative and inspired at the same time. And the critique comes out of the genealogical norms that it's based on. So I'm quite interested in this thing, in exploring this further, and it's quite helpful to look at praise poetry, and that's what I'll try to talk about at the end. Anyway, so he died recently, and there we have Buthelezi saying it's a legacy that will go down in history. And at the same time, you know, the praise poetry had to admit that stuff happened with the collusion with apartheid, where Inkatha was used, and the Bantustan and ethnic identity was used to support apartheid. Anyway, it's interesting to look at this poem from Buli on Madiba's release from prison some time ago, which goes, maybe I shouldn't, anyway, Asina Kujika Dao Ichangan, Umsutu, Inyasa, Umkosa, Ivend, Mtwana, Hai, Mnadoda, Nomzulu, Gokunjalo. So even the Zulus as well. Singabantu, Abanyama, we are all Black people. Hedani, please, son of Mandela. Hedani, Niokutata, Ugacha Bautelezi, Nimfak Istoksini. Go and take him to prison. This is a strange parallel with Ramaphosa's position recently and Jacob Zuma. But the problem is there. He is the one who's connected with the poor whites and the Boers, which results in the death of our people. So the use of ethnic identity and genealogy very much manipulated for ideological purposes and contestation at work in praise poetry. So there's the example. I'll give you a quick overview of what I'm going to talk about here. So talking about ideology, which is self-deceptive acceptance of dominant ideas, which leads us, this is the theory, leads us to act against our interests to benefit elites. So it's irrational, self-defeating, and self-deceptive. And the puzzle is really, why do we fall for it? And conspiracy theories, in a way, are a modern form of ideology, but a very different one from what Marx was identifying. And I think it's very useful to look at the following three figures to understand how it's different from classic ideology critique. So we could talk about Adorno, Foucault, and Sloterdijk. Adorno talks about a move from liberal political economy, which is classic bourgeois ideology, where transcendent universal concepts occlude the immanent content, historical content of events. And he says there's a move in modernity, late capitalist modernity, from bourgeois ideology to positivist ideology, which simply identifies its norms with the real and doesn't pretend anything about universal transcendent concepts. So we move in a way from the critique of ideology, which says, well, look at these universal norms. Everybody knows that's how it goes, to Trump talking about COVID-19 and saying, well, it is what it is, the brutal truth. And in a way, we have a problem today in that the classic conspiracy of these sovereign people behind the scenes, where everyone knows exactly who they are and what's going on. The empress clothes are transparent. Rhodes, Rockefeller, Rupert, Rothschild, everyone can talk about, you know, the conspiracy that's ruling our lives, and no one believes the authoritative truth, so that even people can start to believe you shouldn't really vaccinate, and hey, there's no climate change, because it's all part of some big conspiracy. So in a way, ideology critique can become self-defeating by exposing a gap between transcendent universal norms, which hold us up to a higher standard, and just, you know, going with what's going on. That's another form of ideology, and it's a more insidious form that we are suffering from today. Then Foucault talks about governmentality in an analogous way, saying that there's been a misunderstanding of power in late capitalist modernity, where we still blinded by an idea of power as coming from a king, from a center, and up top, power from above. And we think emancipation, well, if it's coming from below, emancipation comes from below. But the problem is these days, the sovereign's dead, and that distracts us. Us thinking power controls us from above distracts us from the fact that we're the ones acting on behalf of power, and it's coming from below through us. And this is neoliberal governmentality, so through disciplinary norms. So again, we're looking above for power, and we're enacting our own domination. Sloterdijk then tries to explain the mechanism of the self-deception. If the classic thesis of repression, sovereign repression, does not hold, and also it's mysterious, like how can you deceive yourself? There's a mystery to self-deception, which is never really answered. In fact, Freud, in his late work, has a theory of displacement, which is that simply by being displaced from one situation to another, you lose touch with the agonistic power relations which inform the reified, the displaced experience that you have. So you don't know what's animating your present reality because you're displaced from the context of agonism that would make sense of it. I don't know if that makes sense. But anyway, that's the big story. And so, since classic ideology critique it fails in positivist ideology and governmentality, it's useful to look at genealogy as an alternative which breaks with the dialectical simplicity of classic Marxist ideology critique. And moreover, it's quite interesting to see how Allsobrook's poetry conforms to the criteria of genealogy. And if I don't get through the paper, at least you know what I want to say. So I'll start off by talking, as if I haven't been talking for ages, about identity thinking in ideology. So you can understand a bit more about classic ideology. So according to Adorno, at least, this is kind of the theory and a common theory at the time, Kantian kind of idea. In identity thinking, masses of immanent sensory content are thought through processes of sensing, then interpretation, understanding, judgment, and dreaming, whereby we apply categorical universal concepts, generalizing concepts, on top or to our sensory experience in order to make sense of it rationally. So it's not just chaotic experience, it's nicely organized in predictable forms that we, share with each other in language. And these concepts are also understood often through, moralistic tales. That's how we understand moralistic concepts, just through fairy tales we told when we were children. And late, when you're older, you get new fairy tales like the phenomenology of spirit, or Das Kapital, the dialectic of enlightenment, where, capitalism all of a sudden becomes this really useful term to explain pretty much anything, like neoliberalism maybe. But I don't want to knock myself down there, perhaps. I think these are useful terms. It's just they can become reified, just like. Anyway, so Horkheimer and Adorno in the dialectic of enlightenment judge enlightenment as conceptual domination or identity thinking, where in the transcendent universal categorical concepts which dominate the immanent content of experience, such that we fail to perceive details that don't fit the concepts, ideals, or stories about such instances. I don't know if you know what I mean, but like you'll experience something, you might have a conversation with someone, and your concept of how to make sense of what they're saying will actually cut off some of the things that they are saying, just simply because your concepts have occluded the content, right? You've covered over the words that are coming out with your understanding, your conceptual understanding. That's basically a problem of domination, and then rational thinking in this way perpetuates domination simply in virtue of this mode of identity thinking. Right. So in bourgeois ideology, or in classic Marxist capitalism, say for instance, Marx looks at classical liberal political economy, and he shows how the forms of understanding have hidden the actual content that leads to those forms, and such that these concepts begin to contradict the very content that they ought to represent. And by demonstrating how these concepts formed by the immanent content of history and exposing these contradictions, he shows how we could perhaps improve our concepts and also where history is going that these classic liberal political economists cannot see. So basically by exposing the gap between the immanent and the transcendent form, the immanent content and the transcendent form. Now the problem with the positivist ideology, as I tried to explain earlier, is that there's a simple identification of what ought to be with the real. And so, for instance, and I think this is what we see with conspiracy theories now, is that there's a sort of immobilizing incredulity, where we don't believe in these transcendent concepts, and so we don't trust authoritative universal discourse, and it's not through believing stupid things, but rather disbelieving pretty authoritative facts that we come to succumb to credulous conspiracy theories. That's the story anyway. So let me come back to me. I'll stop sharing if I can. Actually, I don't know how to stop sharing. Oh, there. Okay. So that's the problem. How does ideology critique or genealogy work on the problem? Well, genealogy and ideology criticism are like psychoanalysis in that they reflect on underlying conditions and motivations which agents neglect or take for granted, with the effect that these ideas the agents through these ideas begin actively to frustrate their real interests, and these theories and these modes of social criticism aim at self-clarification, right? To expose disavowed or hidden motivations beneath dominant accepted values and social phenomena. And genealogy and ideology critique both aim at forms of self-imposed constraint on our capacity for self-government, in which we're held captive by a restricted perspective, which makes self-defeating norms of conduct appear the only way to do things. And this is aided by the fact that agents do not realize that such coercion is self-imposed. Okay, so what you find with genealogy and ideology critique is they often give polemical accounts of the origins of conventional immanent self-ascriptions, militating against acceptance and affirmation of the status quo, in order to provoke readers to reevaluate reified dogma that's been so misused in habitual repetition that it's lost its ostensible purpose. And interestingly, in these Isibongo, you have these like really reified, predictable, repeated for years and years and years, and yet they're made up on the spot, right? And in that creative inspiration, the variation is what brings out the strikingness of the critique. Okay. So by contrasting antagonistic perspectives in the presentation of the norm, genealogy, the normative ideology to which one is a subject, genealogy opens up rational agency by opening up the underlying agonism for us to see. And that shows us the limitations of our perspective, not by presenting the truth, but by presenting an agonistic perspective, equally plausible or superior perspective, to show how our ideology inhibits self-government. So I'll give you an example. You must know capital. That's capital. In a way, you cast it as a mode of genealogy, but it's ideology criticism. In fact, what you have with capital is ideology criticism plus revolutionary emancipation. And it's the revolutionary emancipation that is the problem that can make ideology critique ideology, and which is why I would propose that genealogy is an improvement which is better able to deal with that problem of self-implication. So Capital begins with an immanent criticism of its object that demonstrates inconsistency and conflict in dominant self-interpretations. It's then contrasted against multiple shifting perspectives that reveal alternative feasible perspectives. This break with determinism, then, because of the multiple could-have-beens and would-have-beens and forces at work, breaks with determinism. And in that sense, is enabling of power to the benefit of agents who'd failed to realize that things could be otherwise, and that the power to effect change has been in their grasp all along, since they are the very agents of their own domination. Nietzsche and Marx both use multiple perspectives to demonstrate mutable historical genesis and connections between dominant social norms, beliefs, and conflicts of interest from a naturalistic, materialist standpoint in history. However, the problem with Marx is he aims at emancipation from power, and therefore retains a taste for the unconditional, which is Nietzsche's critique of Christianity, which is to expect independent or transcendent values from heaven and not from where we are. And Marxist ideology criticism, because of this emancipatory standpoint, has therefore proved historically weak on agency and vulnerable to colonization of its independent emancipatory standpoint. It has failed to keep up with the ability of oppressive regimes to accommodate and incorporate and utilize and colonize emancipatory discourse. So the critique then in Foucault and in Adorno of ideology critique is its self-exemption. There's various ways of trying to solve that problem of self-exemption, where ideology critique is bound to become ideology because of its self-exemption. Okay. Adorno, following Nietzsche, notes that Nietzsche's ontologization of relations of power addresses the transcendent of Marxist or Hegelian dialectical critique with suspicion. Adorno, like Nietzsche, is critical of the Socratic optimism in Marx, in the dialectic, in the simple dialectical movement of immanence and transcendence in contradiction. And the reason is that they both Hegel and Marx both assume that reason is intrinsically emancipatory. And so Adorno is wary of presuming a selfless appeal to the objective common good in social criticism. The problem with Socratic optimism, that reason in history, that you can just look at immanent content and find the movement forward, is that it absconds from the normative responsibility of a social critic and thereby obscures the role of the social critic in criticism. Socrates famously has nothing to add, but always gets his way. Adorno is critical of presupposing intrinsic emancipatory rationality in history, and he's wary of the ideological function of emancipatory critique. And in his later work, he therefore postulates a utopian ideal that is immunized from ideological complicity by a kind of Bilderverbot. But the cost of immunizing his emancipatory idea in this way is it's immunized from critical reflection and indeed from discursive thought altogether. And so his dialectical negativism is thus ideological in its own right, even if it's also impossible to understand. Anyway, so genealogy, by contrast, presumes that no perspective it just bites the bullet. It presumes no perspective is inherently valuable. It doesn't presume emancipatory value for its own standpoint. Its value depends on contextual evaluation and interpretation. Okay. It's I don't know how am I doing for time here. Let's see. Can't really tell.
Chris, you have I'd say about 15 more minutes or so.
Okay, That's good. Thank you. Thanks, Andrea. So here's the conspiracy, and then I'll tell you the truth. The truth is, I'm afraid, quite boring. The conspiracy is fascinating, endlessly fascinating. I can't even tell you all about it. But Alice, yeah, I work in Alice. Edikeni. And there's some interesting things about Alice. I've looked at my own ancestry and found a story of Alice. And why is this place called Alice? Alice never went there. Alice is the daughter of Queen Victoria, one of the daughters of Queen Victoria. And she later on in 1877 became the Grand Duchess of Hesse. Okay. Why is the place called Alice? Also, I have a family member back in my family tree, Liddell, who's a big Freemason, and the magistrate in Alice. His name was Liddell. Now, Alice Liddell is the original Alice in Wonderland. So this really takes one down a rabbit hole. Why is that place called Alice? What's the story behind it? Well, there's an interesting story behind it, in fact. The reason it's called Alice is it's named after Alice and the Queen Victoria's daughter. And if you follow up who she is, you find she's the Grand Duchess of Hesse. And why the connection to Hesse? Well, Hesse is where Frankfurt is. It's a district where Frankfurt is. And interestingly, it was the only profitable state in Europe at one point because it borrowed money from investors to pay for. It sold out its population as mercenaries to other armies to fight, and used that money to make a profit. And then when Napoleon invaded, the Duke of Hesse had to run away to England. He left his money with Meyer Rothschild. Meyer Rothschild invested it, did quite well with the money, also made a huge bet that England would beat France at Waterloo. He knew just in advance of everyone on the market that it would, because of his brilliant communication networks, and made a hell of a lot of money. When Hesse came back after Napoleon was gone and defeated, Rothschild said, "Hey, I've got all your money, I kept it." And Hesse had really thought he'd been destitute. He'd lost all his money. He couldn't believe this guy had been so honest to keep all his money and even make a profit with it, he gave him the money back, gave him the profit, which he all kept in his name as his own business. And so Hesse was set up. Now, Rothschild was also set up through this massive amount of money as he became the banker to the Frankfurt, the only profitable state in Europe. And Rothschild then became friends with the Prince Regent, and Britain then started hawking out, similarly to Hesse, it also became a profitable country, a war machine, basically, hawking out the national debt on speculative bets that they would beat other countries. And basically becoming a capitalist state. Anyway, a series of the royalty became permanently indebted to the Rothschilds in this process. And interestingly enough, when diamonds were discovered in Kimberley, they found there were so many diamonds that diamonds would then become worthless on the market. And in order to keep the market right, so that it would be profitable to mine those diamonds in the hard blue earth, they needed to monopolize the entire market, so the various players would cut each other, and Rhodes took over by getting money from the Rothschilds, who funded basically the British purse. And that's how they took over Kimberley and South Africa. And that money was then offered to Walter Rubusana, who was the editor of Izwi Lebantu here in East London, who was one of the founders of the ANC, which was the SANNC at the time, in order to set up a college like Rhodes, a black Rhodes, right near Grahamstown in Alice. And sorry, in Queenstown, in fact, which would have been the Queen Victoria Memorial College. But that never happened in the end. So in fact, the entire conspiracy behind the ANC being funded by the Rothschilds, Jewish capital, which monopolized the country, is not entirely, didn't obtain in the end, even though that was the intention. So that was the conspiracy. The conspiracy never really took off. And funnily enough, the reason that the conspiracy never took off is because, as Mackay says in his poem on the opening of the University of Port Hare, Maibulwewi bunga ledale collegi. In fact, what happened is Cape colonial politics interrupted with the imperialist vision of Rhodes, petty nationalists who wanted money for the colony and not for the empire in the Cape, wanted a college at the same time for Black people because they were worried about the threat of Ethiopianism, and they wanted Black education to be under the thumb of the colony. They funded the Mfengu John Tengu Jabavu from King Williamstown, whose son was barred from Dale and wanted somewhere for his son to be educated, and went around campaigning for the South African Native College, which was what actually we ended up with in Alice. So interestingly enough, most of the stories about Alice that would lead you to believe in a grand conspiracy about capitalist supremacy comes north, and the true story is just what actually, the boring story of what actually happened. So what am I trying to show here is that the myth of sovereign repression fuels conspiracy thinking that includes the immanent content of boring reality. In fact, if you come to Alice today, what you might have thought in 1925 would become some symbol of British imperial history is just kind of messy post-Bungelstein university that it is. And Alice, unfortunately, Alice doesn't really live there anymore. And if you're looking for someone who's in control of it all, there's no one in control of it all. There's no one fueling or directing any conspiracy. We really just are in that boat at sea. For a long time, I was brought up with sovereign repression, as a white European South African. And I thought people were watching me the whole time, with neoliberal governmentality at work in the administrative unit. What I realized after some time at universities, people don't really know. No one's in charge of anything, really. It's getting a bit better now. We've got a kind of Ramaphosa moment and the Buhlungu, but really there's no one in charge. There's no sovereign. There's no sovereign. All our pain is from us. We're the ones causing our pain in an irrational and self-defeating fashion. It'd be nice to believe in a grand conspiracy, but the ideology is in us. And decolonization is kind of over. So the problem of emancipation from the sovereign is that in our emancipation, we bring with us our ideological our governmentality. And the idea of simple dialectical progress from the working class or from below is sadly misguided. And that's not necessarily the route to historical liberation from power. And so the simplicity of Socratic optimism is the problem, and genealogy aims for greater complexity in looking into identity. I hope I can get to tell you a little bit about that, but genealogy follows Nietzsche against Socratic optimism and Foucault against Marxian dialectical emancipation. The dodgy underhanded agenda of a myotic dialectician who claims to know or bring nothing to the table. The problem in dialectical ideology critique is that agency remains under-theorized because of the standpoint of emancipation is not itself embroiled in the relations of power that are subject to critique. So it's the independent standpoint that's the problem. We can't depend for revolution on moralistic altruism, nor dominate. Yeah, you get the picture. Here is the picture. Here's a picture of some permanent revolutionaries marching to save lives as they spread COVID-19. Recently, the Youth League decided that they weren't going to support the expropriation without compensation bill. So the Son of the Soil, whose Like Party's sole mission is about expropriation with compensation, they're not going to support it. And so it's not going to get through Parliament, right? It's not going to get through Parliament. And you think, well, what the hell are they doing here? But imagine if it got, so they say the reason is because they want full nationalization of all the land all of a sudden. First they said, no, you ANC, you've stolen our expropriation with compensation. Then they came, no, we're quite different. We want nationalization of it. If they had nationalization of the land, that would be the ANC in control of all the land, right? So where would be the space for the EFF? There would be no space. That's not something they actually want to accomplish. So what they claim to stand for is not what they want to accomplish, because it will undermine their very raison d'etre. And therefore we have permanent immortal revolution serving ideological purposes, with the EFF as an example. We could have some more examples, more revolution. We go from direct imperial rule to trusteeship in history. We go from colonialism to neo-imperial decolonization, from Victorian moralism to positivist ideology, sovereign power to governmentality, repression to displacement, political to economic apartheid, corporate hegemony to bespoke influences. It's all coming from below. It's all through emancipation, and that's how they get us. That's how they get us. Amandla, please subscribe. Maibuya, Ndini Yamalala. And so Ndini Yamalala, stop sharing screen. I'm back. Could talk more about governmentality, although I fear I'd run out of time. But what we find, at least I could say, is that domination occurs along the road to Wellville, right? Foucault notes that domination as a sovereign, repressive, universal normative discourse, power from above, is a red herring which distracts from productive capillary disciplinary power that draws on our self-defeating agency to benefit dominant others. Foucault's ontology of power in Genealogy, unlike ideology critique, calls ideologies into question without rejecting them, such that agents' interests are brought into play in their re-evaluation. I wanted to talk about displacement as a mechanism of ideology. I wonder if that's going to be entirely possible, but I could at least say that genealogy is a mode of therapy, which shows us how we've developed a taste for the unconditional, not only from the perspective of Judeo-Christian morality, but also from his own perspective, which ranks superior because it is able to explain the perspective of Christian Judeo-morality on its own terms, and on its own terms show how this is an improved perspective, which leads to greater insight. So that doesn't step out of the bounds of critique. Like ideology critique, genealogy gives a critical account of ideological forms of consciousness, which lead agents to reevaluate their function in reinforcing self-defeating behavior to the benefit of dominant elites. So, for instance, the ANC is engaged in an internal critique of political suicide under Zukta era state capture. They've realized they were captured by an ideology. And it's the genealogy of the ANC that really proved crucial in undermining that captivity. You can find it very much in Okai Toby's The Land book, which is not about the land, which is about the genealogy of ANC history, which totally undermines the Zukta project. Historically situated immanent critique of metaphysical abstraction. Could be racist, could be ethnic, nationalist, liberal, idealist, rationalist. In ideology, the false consciousness is not false in terms of truth. You could have truth, which is false consciousness. The false consciousness is false interests. But unlike ideology critique, genealogy presumes an historicist ontology of productive power. So power is always at work, even in the mode of critique. It allows for non-binary complexity by breaking with dialectical the neat dialectic between immanence and transcendence by demonstrating multiple and agonistic perspectives. And it allows for no transcendent self-exemption precisely because of the ontology of productive power.
Chris, sorry to interrupt you, but could I ask you to maybe wrap up so we have time for some discussion?
Yes, certainly. Yes, it's 40. Okay. Well, this is just examples, right? So I am trying to show at the moment, towards the end of this book, how genealogy in praise poetry helps, in a way, to perform this mode of contra-identity thinking. And I could, I would therefore be able to show this if I had more time. Perhaps one might look at Christianity, right? Christianity is this is a sort of mode of evolution that no, I can't talk about it that way. Let's talk about it this way. I'll wrap up here. Okay, so what you have, why is it similar? In Izibongo, so for instance, in Kiva's The Honeybird is Never Without Plans, the past history of the ANC and its leaders is given, but also interwoven with reference to present conditions. Critical element is reserved for apartheid and those who upheld it. So it's praise poetry with a critical element. And the genealogy of fixed praise is assembled about the chief as a normative basis to evaluate current events. So the genealogy is a normative basis for the evaluation of legitimacy. And in common praise names, history, ancestry, character, deeds, and place are presented for critical comment. The Imibongi are, in a sense, engaged in placed mimesis, speaking of place and genealogy in order to root their critique and to expose agonistic dynamics at work. There's an ambiguity in the parallelism and the contrast to criticize and protest and yet legitimize at once. The formulaic repetition in the genealogy of praise names sets a basis for the striking critical variation in inspirational praise poetry. And in the act of giving praise, there's a certain poetic license of free speech, which allows for critical appraisal. So in a sense, it is a mediation between the object of critique and the subject of critique. So I've never really thought about the fact that genealogy is actually about genealogy. And it becomes apparent if you actually look at your family history. My name is Allsobrook, but if I go back to my great-grandparents, my name is Allsobrook, Barrow, Akers, Nolte, McPherson, Wills, Hartley, Duplessis. And similarly, if you look at the history of the NIXVM Executive Success Program, which has recently come undone by Me Too, it's what's it at the bottom looks quite simple with a simple name, Hare. If you look at the roots, it becomes quite a complex genealogy, which is not dialectically simple at all. There's Rand's objectivism, multi-level marketing, Earhart's EST, Hubbard's Scientology, Freudian psychoanalysis, space opera, saucer culture. There's all sorts of stuff that is packed into this final ideological product, and all of its underlying, anyway, so by exposing that, there's a multiplicity and complexity that is exposed, which breaks with the dialectical simplicity of ideology critique. I think I better stop there for questions. Thanks.
Thanks, Chris. I'm going to put me back onto video. That was enormously dense, enormously complex, so many issues there. yeah, I've got 100,000 questions, but perhaps I should open it up to people and just say that if you'd like to chat to Chris, raise some issues, ask for clarification, maybe either put your hand up and use that hand raising function, and I will open it up for you to speak. Or if you would prefer to just ask a question in the chat session, we can actually do it that way too. So both those options, I'll try to keep an eye on what's going on and change my view to perhaps a gallery view so I can see what's going on with everybody. Yes, so if I can see a hand raised, then I will be very happy to open you up and let you chat. And me, of course, being very anxious about silences and things, I'd very much like to jump in as the chair. So one of the things I'd like to ask you, Chris, is this, I'd very much like you to talk a bit more about this idea of displacement from a sense-making context. What I thought there, and I hope I'm right about this, is that kind of displacement that you're talking about, rather than active self-deception from a sense-making context, leads you to make quite simplistic evaluations of a context. And then from what I get from what you're saying, genealogy would replace you in a way, put you back into the very complexity of what actually went into the decision that, or the idea that you have of a situation now. So that's the link with complexity. I'm not sure if that's right. Does that make some sense?
Yeah. Thanks, Andrea. That's exactly right. So displacement, I didn't have much time to talk about it. I've just written something on it. Actually, it's just come out about. I used that concept of displacement, which I found incredibly useful since I've actually written this thesis. So it's quite complicated. There's a story in Sloterdijk about Derrida. He's got this tribute to Derrida, and he talks about how Freud, when he's almost dying, drops this concept of repression and starts to talk about displacement. And he does it through Moses and monotheism, which is a story of displacement, which is a story of the displacement of the Egyptian religion in the hands of Jewish agents. And then in Egypt, in ancient Egypt, the gods were placed with pyramids, right? Their sense of place was very apparent. And if there was the universal forms, everyone could always see what was the agonistic context at work, right? So if you present a universal form, people can pick up on it and run and play and bring into being their own perspective. But these things become reified when they're taken out of our hands. And it's that move to text, away from the pyramid, in alphabetic text, something that can be portable and displaced from Egypt, carried around the world in Exodus. These universal norms, this one God, becomes something that has that loses we lose a sense of the agonism at work that allows for emancipatory potential in the universal form. And it's by displaced from the embodied content. That's kind of classic reification. You can talk about physical displacement, where, for instance, the Xhosa family is broken down in the move backwards and forwards to the mines in Joburg. So that's a sense of physical displacement, and people, removed from their homes and losing a sense of their culture and ties that bind them together in peace. We also talk about conceptual displacement, which Ramosa talks about, which is, he talks about epistemicide, where African knowledge is displaced by Western forms of understanding of rights, constitutionalism, language, political, economic forms, culture, technology, and so on. And actually in that paper, I talk about a sort of meta displacement, which is just displacement in itself. which is the disembodied abstraction of the truth of ideas in, say, Platonic understanding from their embodied sense of place, so that we believe more in our ideas than in that which historical content that informs them. And therefore genealogy is a therapeutic mode of critique, which brings these forces back into play. There's a nice poem there which I wanted to actually talk about. It's called Ntabelanga by John Solelo, which very much does that. You know, there's no simplistic, hey, the Sirayeli and the colonial government. It's just at stake. Everything's at stake that was at stake in that place.
Okay, Chris, thank you. I see there's a hand up from Anton. Would you like to, yes?
Hi, thanks for that, Chris. That was very rich and interesting. My own research is quite interested in this idea of motivated reasoning and socially motivated reasoning specifically, I suppose. And you were talking about this kind of capacity of people to kind of cut off information and only really focus in on the things that sort of resonate with them and sort of willfully ignore almost. So that's an area that's fortunately quite well researched in social psychology. And I'm just curious, you talked about this idea that people don't believe in the transcendent concepts anymore, and this kind of leading to this distrust of authoritative sources of information. And I've just done a little study where I collected data on this, and my data supports that idea that people who hold views like they don't trust climate change, they're suspicious about information about COVID vaccinations, they almost all universally don't trust authoritative institutions of information. But I was wondering,
we've all done our own research now on the internet.
But there seems to be at least in the data that I'm looking at, there's populations of people that hold these beliefs, and then there are those who seem to not. They do believe that authoritative sources of information, they don't act in the way that you would expect. So what would you attribute those individual differences to? Like, why do some people fall for this and others don't?
I reckon it's about being informed. I honestly think maybe this is dismissive and condescending, but I think if you go into the complex, for instance, you think that if you get vaccinated, you're going to be tracked, right? And you got this from a device that tracks you. If you interrogate where you're getting your information from, and in fact, you have someone to help you, criticizing it, and you're up on engaging with that critically, you're more likely to be informed, to be a bit better informed. People become, the problem is the colonization of authoritative discourse leads people to distrust. You know, it's rational. But then that moment of emancipatory distrust in itself can be colonized.
Right.
That's what seems to have happened now, in that, you know, like, I can't remember. There was some massive thing that happened recently. There was 12 people behind it or something in the end. I really can't remember the example. But what makes it different, I guess, is the critique. Going underneath the idea that you have. And that involves stepping out of your idea, right? For instance, if you're going to engage in criticism of conspiracy theories, for instance, you then have to pull the person from their own perspective. You can't just say, hey, no, this is the actual truth, because then you get a polarizing dialectic. You somehow have to be plausible on the terms of the position you're subjecting to critique, and then at the same time present a superior position which is plausible from those terms.
Good, thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Chris. I see that Claudia has her hand up. Would you like to sort of open up and chat to us?
Hi, thank you very much for an interesting paper. So my question is really returning to the idea of epistemicide that you spoke about earlier, before Anton's question. And I was just wondering, there's been some critique of it because of the idea that epistemicide doesn't leave a lot of room for agency or self-emancipation.
Yeah.
And I just wondered what your thoughts were on that.
Yeah, thank you for asking that. I didn't actually get to talk what I wanted to talk about that a little bit. You know, Ramosa talks about epistemicide, displacement, and I think he's quite right. Raymond Goyce talks about a similar problem. I think Ramosa, to be honest, is pessimistic. If you look at Goyce's story, the same account, right? He says successful critique or ideological colonization, which is epistemicide, right? He says it cannot displace all that it succeeds. Otherwise, it's got no host, right? Needs some of the shape of the host. If we look at Christianity, it's a very successful colonizer. Capitalism too. Successful critique or successful interpretation takes over an existing set of practices, sure, but never so successfully as to eradicate previously accumulated, sedimented layers of meaning, which may be manipulated, never eradicated. They determine the contours of the next layer. So, and this is possible. You might be, well, Christianity, agent of colonial capital, but very soon you have the situation in Tambelanga, where, in fact, you have Catholic Christianity taking over pagan Easter, pagan Christmas, pagan Halloween. Then you have the Wesleyan Methodists critiquing Catholic Christianity. And that same critique is taken on by the very people that they colonized, such that you have this Ethiopianist, Africanist Zionism in Tambelanga, where the Israeli just stand in front of soldiers, 800 soldiers or 200 people, and they get mowed down. And afterwards, they don't say, they don't moan about it, because they said, we told you this was going to happen. This is exactly what we predicted. It happened. And we will continue to live here to remind you of it.
Yeah, and in fact, in the Ethiopian Zionist churches, there's been an infiltration of praise singing and praise poetry as well.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Fascinating. Yeah.
So there's that you could say that's a mode of critique, right? Incorporation. And in fact, what I'm trying to do with this book at the end is precisely appropriate Zibongi for my purposes. So I hope I'm successful, but I won't be able to eradicate the previous layers.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Looking forward to reading it.
Yeah. Chris, we have time for just one more quick engagement. And I see that Gary has put a comment about the 12 people you mentioned. Apologies, airplane. Let's just 2 minutes, 2 seconds.
Just a story I read recently.
Yes, Gary, would you like to come on and just chat a little bit about that? There we go. Hi, Gary.
Hi, Andrea. Chris, thanks very much. That's very, very interesting. I'm assuming that the 12 people you were talking about is the sort of central core of that gave rise to the Free Zoomer insurrection stuff that took place in the KZN.
Yeah, maybe that's right.
Yeah. So where on WhatsApp they basically coordinated this insurrection and drove it, so it's centered on 12 people. It's probably slightly more, but that's if I recall, that's
number. The 30 dozen, the 12 disciples, and not the new cabinet.
Could I perhaps maybe ask you just a very simple question, and that is, when you talk about ideology, what do you mean by ideology? What is ideology for you? Okay,
so it's negative. I don't think you can have positive. Well, at least you could have positive ideology, but that's not what I'm talking about. So I'm talking about ideology in a pejorative sense, self-deceptive acceptance of dominant ideas that leads us to act against our interests to the benefit of elite others or dominant others. Self-deceptive acceptance of dominant ideas that leads us to act against our interests, self-defeating, in such a way that benefits dominant others.
So Trump
and
supporters, sorry, Gary, would that be an example?
Yeah, I guess, yeah.
Okay,
Although, I mean, not all dominant others, yeah.
Okay, just an intervention. Sorry, Gary, carry on.
No, I was just going to say that, I mean, isn't it positive in the sense that we continuously do it, that it's a key mechanism of human being is that we rely on ideology. I mean, you know, so maybe it's a sort of short, you know, to Anton's earlier point about social psychology, is that we coalesce our ideas around this core that we don't interrogate, because it allows us to shortcut through a whole a bunch of stuff. You know, it gives us solutions to
That's
problems.
True. That's true. It's not necessarily self-defeating.
No.
And ideology is the term I'm using anyway, is when it is self-defeating. So when that mode of thinking, which is thinking, becomes self-defeating.
Okay, fantastic.
And how do you get out of it? And what I'm suggesting is that you can't have the right perspective to get out of it. It's rather a mode of critique that helps people, but you know, doesn't guarantee anything. But why are you suggesting though that there's no that ideology is all pervasive in thinking?
I mean, I think categorization of information for us is a fundamental human trait that we have very successfully survived around, you know, even though it's irrational at times, but it's a very strong binding agent for us, and a very pragmatic way of dealing with the massive information that we faced, even, you know, particularly now, you know. So we revert to ideology, and in a positive sense, that it allows us to then quickly process a whole bunch of things, you know. So we don't actually have to rework every problem that we face. We just apply the ideology to that. And I'm not sure that we will ever get out of a mechanism, you know. So that's the fundamental thing about complexity, is the human capacity to deal with complexity is limited. And so we then use tools like ideology or stereotypes, etc., to fast track our way through that. I'm not sure that we'll ever get to the point that we can't do that.
No, I wouldn't suggest that either. Certainly not. But I do think it doesn't have to be self-defeating.
Yeah.
So, for instance, you know, a sovereign monarch, hey, Zwelithini had his thing, in a positive sense. So did Dalindyebo, you know. There was a reason why they chose Matanzima over Dalindyebo. And you know, when the Imibongis engaged in critique, mostly it's an affirmation of those universal modes of those normative modes of conduct. And it's only the variation, which is only striking because it's unusual and it steps out, that you find any critical inspirational movement. The evaluation wouldn't obtain without the genealogy, without the affirmation of repetitive, well-known, common terms that everyone can access. But it's the disruption that helps to defeat irrational, self-defeating behavior, which undermines our capacity for self-government when we inherit the terms of others, which are put to uses that were never intended, when they become colonized.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me of I think Kuhn's point in terms of scientific revolutions, that you can never step outside of yourself in terms of the change that you bring, that you always have to start where you're at. I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but you're never able to step outside of your consciousness. You know, and that's why psychedelic drugs is such a mind-blowing thing, is because you actually step outside of your normal consciousness.
Dragged out of it.
Yeah. No, you know, and so and I think that's the problem for us, is that you can never really step. I mean, and that's, if I understand what you're saying about genealogy, is that it's a foundation of foundations. You know, that you build this. You never lose the trace element running through it.
Yeah. In the critique, is that it has to come from anyway to be plausible to the person that you're talking to, and I think that's right. So instead of having a polarity, which seems to be a problem with conspiracy culture, or I don't know what's gone on at the moment. Certainly in America, there's massive polarity, and hey, under Zuma, there was some serious polarity in those Bell Pottinger ideology that we fell under the spell of for quite some time.
Chris, I don't want to stop a conversation between philosophers, but I know this could go on for another 3 weeks, yeah, particularly given he's...
I better come to PE, I think, Andrea.
I think we need to... Yes, Rebecca, we need to invite you as soon as we are all either have had COVID or are vaccinated. We will... hopefully get back to as a face-to-face thing. We have actually gone quite a bit over time, so I think it is a good time to wrap up and just say thank you to Chris for a very, very rich, quite mind-blowing presentation. There was so much in it. Sometimes I was feeling quite helpless, like, oh my gosh, how am I going to follow this? So I think we certainly need a follow-up visit, and with a, you know, kind of a longer time to talk about these things. But yes, I just want to say thank you to everyone for joining us, and I'd very much like you to put your cameras on just to say goodbye before you leave, if that's possible, so we can see some faces. And yes, just a reminder that we will be taking a 2-week break. It's not that we've stopped our seminar. We have these fascinating seminars lined up for you. But yes, some of us just need a very serious long 2-week break. Some of us, one of us, not me. And we will pick up again after 2 weeks or so. So yes, thank you very much for joining us, and cheers. We'll see you
Andrea.
next time. Thank you, Chris. Yes.
Thanks, Chris.
Very fascinating.
Cheers.
Thanks for the opportunity. Honestly, I've just been working on this on my own most of this year on sabbatical, so it's been good to talk through it in a structure that, more structured sense.
Yes, yes. Well, we would love to see you in a, you know, in a more kind of, you know, lengthier kind of format where we can actually get into the nitty gritty. There's very many things I thought, I don't quite understand what's going on there. And I would very much like to. So yes. Okay. So thanks everybody. We will hopefully see you. I'm seeing quite a few new names. Greg, nice to see you. I hope that you will join us again, maybe even present for us at some point. And yeah, everybody have a wonderful Friday, wonderful Friday night, wonderful weekend. Yes.
Have a good weekend. Thank you.
Hey, thanks. Thanks so much. Cheers. Bye.